All right. Hello and welcome to another episode of the OCD and Anxiety Show. My name is Matt Cotty, and I'm a licensed clinical social worker and the founder of Restored Minds and the creator of the AAA Response. And so, in this episode, we're going to continue our series on common OCD and anxiety mistakes. And specifically, in this episode, we're going to talk about the mistake of fighting with or trying to fight off intrusive or unwanted thoughts, and how this is a trap that most people fall in my experience, and I definitely fell in myself. And so before we dive into the show, again, as always, we would really appreciate your support by liking and subscribing, even if you're on YouTube, hitting the notification bell. And if you're joining us via podcast, leaving us a comment or review on iTunes or Spotify, as it just helps the show. And also, if you are looking for help and resources, we have links right down in the notes where we have, you can get access to the book, you can get access to workshops, and you can obviously complete an application to be a part of our program if that's something that you're interested in, where we can get back to you. So in this series, we started off talking about, like, the first two mistakes we talked about were not prioritizing recovery, right? And really kind of putting it off, so to speak, right? And obviously how that's just a huge, should be pretty obvious mistake, but it's always this idea that, like, I'll handle this one day. I'll handle this when I have more time, when I have more money, and kind of going through it in that manner. And then in the next episode, we talked about the idea of going the lone wolf route and the problems that you encounter there, where you start trading time to do all the wrong things and then figure out they're the wrong things. And then finally, and so there's this whole process of not seeking guidance. And what guidance does is it allows for the time consolidation, right? So anytime you're seeking guidance on anything, what it allows for you to do is to invest in that guidance so that you can time consolidate and you don't have to learn on your own. And the person can really just direct you because they've usually made all those same mistakes, right? And so you're you're investing to bypass all that time. And so those are the first two mistakes that I really stress, and we'll have links to the episodes down below. We'll link them in this as well. And so today, wanted to talk about the idea of the mistake of trying to fight with unwanted and intrusive thoughts. Now, a lot of times, this is really where people will get started, where they start to really notice and become aware and become willing to admit that they're having a problem, right? When it comes to OCD and anxiety. And one of the things that will happen is that their mind will get really fast, and it will start producing thoughts that, are very terrifying to them, and very, really just kind of overwhelming, right? So, when that happens, a lot of times what they try to do is, again, they try to fight off thoughts and feeling, or fight off the thoughts, right? So they try to replace the thoughts, they try to bury them, they try to again, rationalize them, analyze them, ruminate about them, all this stuff. And then they'll do things that avoid certain things. They'll get reassurance, right? All these other behaviors. Now, the issue with fighting thoughts is that, like, yes, while they are disturbing, and it's a very intense experience to be, like, flooded with intrusive thoughts, is that you're not actually addressing the real problem. So one analogy I like to use here, and maybe this will work for you, maybe it won't, but I like to try to throw as many analogies as possible. Is this idea of, like, let's pretend that you lived in a certain house and you had a nice backyard. And you walked out in your backyard and the whole backyard was just covered in mud. So you look at it, and at first obvious glance, and in that narrow perception, you're like, I have a muddy backyard problem, right? And in that case, right, you try to do things to resolve the mud. You might try to shovel the mud out, and you might try to, pour sand on it. You might try to, again, re-dig it up and lay new grass and all this other stuff. And the issue is, but let's pretend in that situation, what's really happening is that you have a hill next to you and a house that's on top of the hill, and they have a water main or a main line that broke, and that water is leaking down into your backyard, creating, excess water, which is, creating mud. And so the reality is if you try to solve a mud problem, in this scenario. You're going to just keep digging mud out, and the mud's just going to show up the next day and the next day and the next day and the next day and the next day. And it's going to lead you to be very frustrated because you're going to be like, well, I'm not getting anywhere. I'm putting all this effort into solving this and nothing's happening. And for many of you, you probably feel like that when it comes to intrusive thoughts and unwanted thoughts with OCD and anxiety, because you might spend your whole day trying to fight the thoughts. You might spend your whole day analyzing, ruminating, trying to make sure you don't get triggered, because I did this. I did this for a long time. And it's overwhelming. It's exhausting. It's extraordinarily frustrating. It's impossible to explain to someone because the general advice you get, even from therapists and psychologists and psychiatrists, is, well, stop worrying about it. Stop thinking about it. And obviously that's not helpful in any way, shape, or form. So if you're trying to solve a mud problem, what you need in that situation, what you would have to do is like, okay, well, like, what's the cause of what's the real problem we have is that there's a pipe broken up there. And if we actually cut the pipe off or plug the leak or, fix the pipe, whatever you want to call it, then the water stops leaking into your backyard and the mud problem kind of resolves itself. Now, in this same metaphor, the cause of the intrusive thoughts oftentimes is just emotion in the body, right? Specifically, usually fear, right? And our unwillingness to experience. And so if you, it's interesting, if you read the book Letting Go by Dr. David Hawkins, he talks about how like one emotion in the nervous system essentially can produce upwards of 1 million different thoughts in the mind, right? And he talks about how the mind's often interpreting the emotion and in many ways trying to keep us safe from the emotion, and because we think emotions are dangerous, or we might have certain beliefs about emotions that are good and bad and ones that we're supposed to feel and not supposed to feel, especially when it comes to like fear, anxiety, right? We might perceive that as bad. So instead of understanding it as a thought problem, we begin to work at it from an anxiety problem, right? Or, even then a fear or emotion, right? And we start learning to work and feel through our emotions, and instead of trying to solve it in the mind. And this has to come obviously from breaking the loop and not doing any behaviors that are trying to get rid of our thoughts or feelings. Okay, so first thing we have to do, which is the very, very cornerstone of all this work with OCD and anxiety, is eliminate all the behaviors that are perpetuating this loop. And one of those is obviously fighting with all the thoughts that we're experiencing, So, in the issue with that is that it feels like the natural thing to do. When you walk outside in your backyard and you see mud everywhere, there's this shame and embarrassment. Oh my gosh, I can't believe there's so much mud. So it feels like there's this pull to like, I need to fix the mud. I need to fix the mud. And instead of that, right, shifting away from that idea and like, where's this really coming from? And then you're able to kind of see it clearly from a wider picture, right? You're like, oh, there's a water leak. Okay, you go help them fix their water leak. And then the mud problem will resolve on its own, right? Very, very similar premise here, right? It is most of the time the problem is that you're trying to, when it comes to the intrusive thoughts and unwanted thoughts, you're trying to fight off the thoughts, and paradoxically what happens is you reinforce that these thoughts are actually dangerous, and as that happens, you create more anxiety and fear around them, and then you engage in safety behaviors, which creates the loop. And as that loop forms, the more the thoughts come up, and then as that happens, the more energy and emotion that comes with the thoughts, and this cycle just starts to build. And if that cycle builds, especially if it starts getting fast enough, then you become hyper aware to triggers that then like your mind almost finds ways to somehow tie your life to these unwanted thoughts. So let's say you were afraid of a certain disease. You might start like finding ways to like tie random things back to that disease, right? Like your mind's very creative like this, right? And you'll start to be like triggered over things that you were never triggered by. right? And it starts to build and gain momentum. And then the problem is this wheel, in many ways can go on for a very, very, very long time. And I think this is why, why I'm so passionate about doing the show, why we, obviously we run TVC with our group programs that we do, live groups every week, right? With our community where we're answering questions live. And then obviously teaching people the AAA response, to really break the wheel. The reason is because just the seriousness of that, like once this wheel gets going, like it really can spin for a long time and really take over your life. And I say that not out of like observation. I say it from like firsthand experience, you know. Um and again, not even knowing what was going on. Like, and metaphorically, I thought I had a mud problem for a long time. I was just shoveling mud like a lunatic, right? Um if I was able to see this 30,000-foot view, I it just would have saved me so much time, so much strain, so much pain, right, on this journey. And once you realize that you really start to see this wheel and really start to not get involved with the thoughts, right? And maybe we'll talk about that in the next episode of like what that even means, because one of the big problems obviously with this is, this idea of cognitive fusion. If you believe you are your thoughts, right, and if we're maintaining that belief and we're not understanding the idea of levels of consciousness, this is why in chapter 6 in the book, I go into such depths of like, look, it's not about like it, like one of the most important things is understanding this idea of consciousness, and not understanding it from a conceptual level but an experiential level. And because if you aren't applying the tools that you learn from a higher level of consciousness, and you're going and trying to again apply the tools to stop the thoughts, you're still focusing on a mud problem, right? It doesn't matter what color the mud is, and metaphorically, it doesn't matter what theme you have. It doesn't matter what your fear is about. It doesn't matter what, like when the what if thought comes in, it doesn't matter what comes after that. It can be about driving. It can be about what if I have a panic attack? What about social situations? What about disease, contamination, intrusive sexual thoughts, harmful thoughts, thoughts about, religion, fear, perfectionism, having to be just right. I mean, the list goes on and on and on and on. And that's you, like when someone talks to me about their certain theme, what they're really saying is they like, what about this mud? And I would still go back to the idea of like, you don't have a mud problem, right? We can't get involved in the thinking aspect of it because you're going to lose every time. So fighting with unwanted thoughts and intrusive thoughts was a huge mistake that I made. And I did it for a long time. And that cost me years of my life. And the hope is by, making this episode, and obviously, the book From Stuck to Unstuck, and then our workshop, and then TBC, is that you can really start to see the problem, what it really is, right? Which is this wheel, and start to do the things that you really need to do to break the wheel. And when you break the wheel, that's how you take back control of your life. So I hope this was helpful. And again, this, the common mistake, to summarize, being don't fight, don't try to control, don't try to get rid of unwanted or intrusive thoughts. They are a byproduct of, they aren't the problem, they are a byproduct of the problem. And it's really important that you start moving into what the real issue is, which is, again, this OCD and anxiety loop. So thank you so much for hanging out today. I hope this has been helpful. And with that said, I wish you guys a great week as always. And I look forward to seeing you on the next episode. Take care.